Welcome to L&D Disrupt, the podcast dedicated to helping you overcome workplace challenges and prepare for the future of work today. I'm your host, Nelson Sivalingam, and I'll be speaking with the movers, shakers, and path breakers in L&D who are reshaping their organizations right now. Join us each week as we delve into the highs and lows of work in the industry to get to the real nitty-gritty stuff that you actually care about. Hi and welcome to the fifth installment of L&D Disrupt Live. Unfortunately, I had some broadband connectivity issues while recording the live show, so just to warn you, you might hear a few glitches here and there. Without further ado, let's get into the episode. Hey everyone, good to see familiar faces again. Let me see if I can recognize some names here. Actually, there's a lot of new people joining us today. If you are new and this is your first L&D Disrupt Live, please do pop your introduction in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. Just a heads up, I seem to be having broadband provider issues in my area right now. So if I am jarring or pixelating, then don't worry, one of my colleagues will step in to make up for my lack of connection. Do let us know where you're joining from. Kenny, where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining from London in the UK, in particular, or specifically, Sydenham in the southeast part of London. I don't know if that's Nelson pausing or or freezing.
I think he's frozen, not just a pause for dramatic effect.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, that does happen to be a particularly helpful facilitational skill if you can sort of utilize the pregnant pause. And I think that's exactly what Nelson was doing until Zoom decided to take over.
Yeah, I think I think Nelson is completely frozen. So look, guys, I think I will step in and do my best Nelson impersonation. I don't quite have the same barking twang as Nelson, but similar to Kenny, I'm from South London, and so it's always good to see a fellow South Londoner on here. And so, first of all, welcome everyone. I've noticed quite a few of you have started to put your cameras on, and feel free to do so. It'd be awesome to see more faces. Today, we have Kenny for our fifth L&D Disrupt. He's the head of culture and inclusion at Improbable, a rapidly scaling startup company, and he's got a wealth of experience around leadership in general. But what I'll do is maybe just ask Kenny to sort of introduce himself a little more to our audience today.
Yeah, thanks, Kumi, and thanks, Georgie, and thanks to Nelson, who I can see is snuck back in the back row there. Really good to meet you all, and some people from, I think, Canada particularly as well. So from far and wide. Kenny Temowo, and I head up culture and inclusion at Improbable, and joined also the company 2 years ago, leading on leadership, development and learning. But actually, hearing it here first, I'm actually moving on from Improbable, as Georgie knows, next week. So sort of, I guess, kind of live on L&D Disrupt, letting the whole world know I'm actually moving to Netflix in a few weeks' time, focusing on organizational development and learning there. So looking forward to sort of that work. But I started out my career in public education, so a lot of the sort of facilitational chops that I picked up was being in a sort of public sector, and then eventually trained as a coach before becoming a sort of a consultant, working with brands such as Rolls-Royce, Vodafone, Johnson & Johnson, the BBC, before joining Improbable. And as Kumi mentioned, we're a sort of tech scale-up, moving quite rapidly into the metaverse, and we also work with a number of AAA game developers supporting their projects. So delighted to be here.
Awesome. And so today, what we're going to be focusing on is the much overlooked and undervalued skill facilitation. And I think the hard truth here is it doesn't matter how great your L&D offerings are if they're not being facilitated well, and you miss out on that opportunity. And I think some of the tech issues we've just faced today are like some of the challenges we've all faced in L&D over the past few years as we've tried to work out remote and hybrid. And even doing that facilitation in person in the classroom to moving online is a completely different game. And so what we're going to do is mix up things in terms of the agenda. And so part of the magic of this is we've got so many great practitioners live on the call, and the question and answer really is where a lot of the magic happens. And so we've got a couple of agenda topics, and we'll pause after each topic and open up the floor for Q&A. So feel free to come on with your cameras and ask away with any questions you might have. But maybe just to set the context, what do you mean by facilitation, Kenny?
Yeah, thanks, Kumi. And I should say, Kumi's you've stepped in at the last minute, and I just want to take if I had a hat on, I'd take it off. And I think that you're demonstrating again one of the sort of core skills is being able to sort of improvise and flex in the moment. So yeah, absolutely, Julie. I think that deserves a sort of round. So what do we mean by facilitation? Well, you'll all have your own sort of take on a facilitation. If you think about the definition, it means to make easy, and essentially the facilitator is to some extent trying to make that process of learning easier. But actually, it's a bit deeper than that. You'll know, because often as a facilitator, you're having to constructively challenge, which doesn't seem like an easy thing. So I think in short, there's sort of two forms. There's the sort of macro facilitation, event facilitation, which is a bit more like being a sort of a master of ceremonies, a sort of host, facilitating an experience. And then there's the sort of facilitation as an intervention. So Byrne, I think it's Eric Byrne, if some of you might be familiar with transactional analysis, talks about sort of 8 different intervention styles, and facilitation is one of them. Being a sort of a catalyst is another one of them. Being more supportive is another. And he's got a range of different styles he talks about. So in short, Kumi, I think facilitation definitionally is about making a process easier, making that process of learning easier. But for me, it's more than that. It's about the facilitation intervention, being able to role play, ask powerful questions, challenge, support, sort of be able to read the room, as well as the sort of general event management piece as well.
And I guess sort of building on that, like what would you say often gets overlooked when we think about facilitation?
What gets overlooked, or do you mean by facilitators, or by the business, or by audience members? Or
yes, I think we could sort of approach that in a couple of different ways. I think just often as a facilitator, what are some of those skills or attributes which are maybe overlooked and actually are more important than we put onus on?
Yeah, really good question. And keen to hear what folk in the room think and what their experiences are on this. From a skills perspective, I think we can keep it really basic. Listening is such an important skill as a facilitator. Ensuring that you're paying attention, that you've heard the question, and you can think about. I don't know if any of you've got a background in coaching, but in coaching we talk about the sort of 3 critical kind of listening skills, where you're summarizing, you're paraphrasing, or you're clarifying. And being able, as a facilitator, to say, hey, Kumi, what I think I heard you say then was, why are certain skills overlooked? Have I got that right? Was that about right? Being able to say that in the moment to show that you're sort of listening and paying attention is a really important skill. I think there are lots of other skills we can sort of talk about. I think there's, some basic things around contracting. When you set up a session, and I think I talked about this in one of the videos that I put on LinkedIn earlier. What are the ways of working? So as a group, for example, imagine we're a group that are about to go on a bit of an experience. And imagine I was facilitating and we just launched straight in. Well, you're all strangers. How are we going to decide to interact as a group? What are the kind of rules of engagement? How do we deal with feedback with each other? What's kind of out of boundaries? When are we deciding to go on a break? All of those things as adults come together, we can't assume those things. So we talk about quote unquote contracting up front, and having the confidence to be able to do that is of supreme importance. So I'd say, there's a whole list of things that I'm missing out, but I think listening and being able to listen well is incredibly important. Being able to contract well up front and not make assumptions is also important. But again, others will have some thoughts and definitely would love to hear if anyone's got sort of particular insights into that.
Awesome. Is there anyone in the audience who has any questions or thoughts around facilitation?
Yeah, Georgina says, contracting is interesting. I wasn't aware of that. And people might find that a bit of a formal term. I often just think of it as ways of working. But as a consultant, we work within, when I was a consultant, we'd often obviously work within contracts. So it was a term that was often used then. But essentially it's how do we want to work as a group? And as you go through the experience, you can then come back to that, I remember, and as people are thinking of maybe questions, I remember facilitating a workshop for a very large aviation organization. And there were a couple of high-powered execs at the back who had their laptops open. But we hadn't been really clear at the beginning around what we expected of each other in terms of paying attention. So halfway through, I sort of paused and said, can I just give you all some feedback? I'm feeling a bit ignored at the moment, and I don't know if some of you are taking notes on the laptop or if you're actually engaging in the lesson, but I wanted to point that out. And again, if we had begun the session being very clear around what the ways of working would be, I could have then pointed back to what we sort of agreed at the beginning. That's a good question. Has anyone got any? Sorry, go ahead, Kumi.
I don't know. I think Laura's just dropped into the chat saying, how do you deal with difficult and disengaged learners? And so you gave one example there. Are there any other examples or practical tips which our audience can put into practice?
Yeah, great question, Laura. First thing would be, why are they disengaged? Let's sort of diagnose, so wanting to diagnose on the fly in real time, why is this person disengaged? Is it because genuinely they've got better places to be? In which case, maybe they shouldn't be there. And maybe there's something about the setup of the session in advance around, who is the audience of who should be in that session. I remember getting some really hard to hear feedback on Peakon once, which is a sort of employee engagement platform. And someone said, I didn't really learn much in Kenny's session. I could have just done with a one-pager with some bullets and I would have been fine. I didn't think it was that efficient use of time. I remember reading it thinking, oh, okay, yeah, that's great. Just popped my balloon just then. And so, sometimes I wouldn't frame it as difficult and disengaged necessarily. I think I'd sort of frame it as there's something that they want, maybe that they're not getting. And so sort of thinking about that. Now, of course, sometimes you will have some derailers. So you will have some genuinely difficult people. Maybe, for example, the company's going through a bit of a organizational change, and someone gets on the mic and says, look, I've had it. No one's going to say this, so I'm going to say it. This change isn't going to work, and I don't know why we're wasting our time on the call. And so, look, Laura's quite right. That would represent a difficult moment. I think it's important to manage your own emotions and avoid getting embroiled into a kind of antagonistic conversation. So you sort of want to step back and do whatever you can do to sort of disarm and de-escalate the experience, but also move things on. So you might say things like, oh, Chris, that's really interesting that you feel like this is a waste of time. I wonder if you could say more about that. Or you might say, appreciate, point noted. Why don't we put a pin in that? Can we come back to this at a different moment? And you might take some time during the break to pick up the call or pick up that conversation. But in essence, it's important to stay composed and to really see what you can do to sort of de-escalate where needed. That would be sort of some thoughts sort of off the cuff.
I think Nelson, are you back?
I'm back. Apologies, my facilitation is being interrupted by my broadband provider, or lack of. But hopefully, we can continue. Kumi, thanks for stepping in. And Kenny, I was listening there. There's so much to kind of unpick, and I'd love to kind of go into the kind of steps to becoming a great facilitator. Maybe starting with the idea of, if I've never facilitated before, where's a good place to start?
Yeah, good question. I think, if you've got external vendors in your organization, contractors, people who are facilitating, see if you can shadow with them, do some shadowing. Maybe you co-facilitate with them. Perhaps someone just said, any advice on co-facilitation, how to build on that dynamic. We can certainly come back to that. But you might, if you're just starting out and you've never facilitated before, maybe you do sort of the contracting phase of a facilitation event, or maybe you do the closing. Maybe you take particular sections and you sort of practice that. It's really important to get feedback. So if you're working with someone and co-facilitating afterwards, ask them how they experienced you, what you could have done differently. Record yourself, watch yourself back. That's one of the most powerful things that I did. Also, most excruciatingly painful things I did was recording myself, listen to myself back. I just wanted to crawl over and get into a corner. But that can be very instructive. And then I think, thinking about everyday actions and everyday skills that you would use in a facilitational sort of encounter. What I mean by that is, you're speaking with a partner, speaking with a family member, use that as a chance to practice your summarizing skills. Use that as a chance to practice your clarifying skills. So you might say something like, hey, Nelson, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. I think what I heard was you were asking about how do you get into facilitation just before I start. Was that about right? So you're constantly practicing those skills in everyday moments, because that's the muscle you're going to need to sort of flex in a facilitation event.
And just diving in, Kenny, to the contracting, because I've seen a few questions come up in the chat about contracting as well. What are kind of examples of implementing contracting? So like you mentioned earlier, so it doesn't come across like a formal exchange. So how do you kind of seamlessly embed it into assessing?
So again, just to practice my own clarifying, I think it cut off a little bit there, but I think what I heard you say was practically what does that look like? Was that what I heard?
Yeah, essentially, what are examples of embedding contracting within a session?
Okay, yeah. So, if you're face to face, you're in person, I'd often you might just have a flip chart, and you might think about the task. So you think about task, process, and relationship. So the task as in, what are we here to do? What's in scope, what's out of scope, and being clear on that. But then also asking, and Leanne, just to pick up on Leanne's point, I think it's a great point there, making it a two-way piece. There's what I think as a facilitator, I'm here to help enable. But what are you here to bring? What is it that you'd like to get out of the session? So one practical thing that we did a lot at PA Consulting was, going around the room and saying, Yarden, what's one thing you would like to get out of today? Claudia, what would you like to get out of today? Aaron, Spencer, what would you like to get out of today? Julie, what would you like to get out? And you write it on the board. And then at the end of the session, you can then come back and say, hey, Julie, I'm interested. Did you find that you got something tangible, from what we talked about at the beginning? So it keeps you honest as a facilitator. And it means that everybody is sort of almost democratically kind of assenting to what we want to focus on throughout the session. So that's kind of the task. The process is things like when should we take a break? Does that work for you? Particularly around things like childcare and working from home, you've got to really think about that. The third one is contracting around relationships. So how do we give each other feedback? What if in this session someone says something which is potentially harmful or gives you a bit of an ouch? How do we respond to that?
Right.
How do we want to respond to that?
And in terms of traits, Kenny, that you think, is there a right way of facilitating, and are there, a set of traits that make a great facilitator?
Yeah, good question. I think there are. I think there's sort of a set of basic traits, and I'll pause here, Sam. I realize everyone's hearing my voice, and I do feel free to chime in. Partly because I'm just, as a facilitator, you're self-aware when you're talking a lot, and so a change in voice is always welcome. So if you've got something you want to chime in and share, please feel free. But to answer your question, Nelson, yeah, I think that there are some core traits around. Self-awareness, I think, is the first one. So, again, just like I was talking about just then, are you aware when you're speaking too fast, for example? Are you aware when the group is maybe a little bit tired, or the group needs to sort of a shift in sort of energy? So those sorts of self-awareness pieces are quite important. Confidence, I think it's incredibly important to be confident and to be able to sort of develop that sense of confidence in front of others. And then you've got the more basic skills that we just talked about, the listening, and then some of the advanced skills, which no one really talks about, I find. Some of those advanced skills are things like, how do you constructively challenge someone? Someone that maybe shows up in a way, and maybe no one's ever held up a mirror to that person. And as a facilitator, you have permission to sort of do that. But, as MCU heroes often say, with great permission or great response, comes great responsibility. And so, great power. So, thinking carefully about, ensuring that you don't, not just about not saying the wrong thing, but demonstrating tact in what you say. I think the last thing I'd say in terms of a trait, and I'm conscious I've missed out a whole host of things. There's sort of this thing around poise. When I was early as a facilitator, I would often apologize a lot. Or say things like, "Oh, I forgot to talk about X, Y, and Z," but no one knows that you forgot to talk about that. So don't let the cat out of the bag. Just keep it going.
Great point, Kenny, and it kind of leads on to a point Anna's made around preparation. Anna, if you'd like to come on and kind of share your thoughts and your question for Kenny.
Hi, I was just thinking about sessions that I've gone to in the past where I think preparation seems to be key, because a lot of facilitators seem to not quite be prepared for what the sessions the format is. We've been to quite a few where they like to use breakout rooms, but they don't really have prepared, how they're going to tell you what they want you to discuss, and they don't formalize like who's going to feed back. And then when you come back into the session, there's like a lot of awkward silence, and people are, the facilitator might be saying, "Oh, so from group one, who's going to speak?" And just kind of a lot of awkward silences sometimes.
That's a fantastic point.
It's a great point. And Kenny, what does your prep planning process look like?
Oh, what does my process look like? Now I've got to reveal the secret arts now, Nelson. That's it's all classified. I've got a Men in Black style zap everyone at the end. No, I think so why don't I talk a bit about how I prepared for this session, and that might be helpful. So I spent a lot of time, I've been thinking about this topic for a long time in any case, but I then spent some time thinking about the questions we talked about, Nelson, and sort of writing my own thoughts about it. And then saying to myself, okay, it's now time to forget it, rather than using a script. I'm not really a believer in scripts, but I recognize it can be helpful for some people. But I feel like it's a bit like going on a date and speaking from a script. There's something quite awkward about that. So my own preparation is often to sort of type out lots of thoughts, but then I'll often jump online earlier, obviously to do the technical checks. But to Anna's point, and again, I just think it's such a fantastic point that Anna's made, is preview the video in your mind. This was an approach that my friend Nick Shackleton-Jones, some of you might know, we work together at PA Consulting, would often talk about. So, play the video of the session in your head and think about all the different touch points. So as you do that, as Anna just mentioned, you'll come to the point in which you're going to send them from the main session into the breakout rooms. And as you do that, you would then stumble upon the reality that, how are they going to know what to do in their breakout room unless they've got one pager which they can use in the breakout room. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that in our Zoom setup internally, I can't share documents through the chat. So what I have to do is I have to add it as an invite into the calendar or through Slack. And so thinking ahead of time by playing the video out and looking at those different touch points. And I find that as someone who, I don't naturally pay attention to detail, it's not a natural thing, but I've had to develop that over time. That technique of just playing the video out in your mind has been quite helpful for me.
Is there any such thing, Kenny, as kind of being over-rehearsed, where you're trying to plan every beat for beat of the session and you're kind of missing out on the spontaneity or anything that comes up in the session that you could build on? Is there a risk of that? Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and again, this is another shout out to a colleague I was working with, Hannah Bauer from Vodafone. I hope she doesn't mind giving her a plug. She's a great facilitator, by the way, and we did some sessions together. And I remember when we were preparing for the session, she said, "Oh yeah, don't worry about the notes. I'll just sort of, I'll make it work." And she was able to draw from obviously experience in order to facilitate. But I think the thing to remember is people want you to be successful as a facilitator. You're watching a facilitator, you want them to do well, but what you want them to do is to show up in an authentic, relatable way. And the challenge with relying on the notes is that it creates a bit of a barrier sometimes between you and the group. Now, if you're just starting out, I don't want you to feel discouraged. You may need to use it at the beginning. But over time, you want to try and show up in a way that allows you to be really attentive to what's being said in the room. We've got a question from Prince Okoro. If you want to comment, it's a great question about engagement. Oh yeah, what's the question there? Let's just have a look. Oh yeah, what do you consider like respectful? If not,
yeah, I mean, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, perfect. So, sort of, how do you navigate through kind of respectful silence? Because when I'm facilitating, I'm running. I'm doing it through Teams. I'm doing things through Microsoft Teams, and I'm showing my display of some of the stuff that we've got there. So I guess I kind of built a barrier initially because I've got to show them detail. But when I'm showing them detail, I'm discussing these detail, and you get that sort of respectful silence to a certain degree. But then I'm trying to navigate through it to get some engagement. But how do I get that engagement where people feel comfortable to speak naturally, but also keeping it kind of top line level? Because what I want to do is not have me speak and get everyone else to kind of engage with it. So, the majority of the conversation or the time, the 30 minutes, is through everyone sharing best practice and sharing ways we can improve.
Yeah, good question, Prince. I think what I heard was, people can be respectfully silent, but what you're trying to do is you want them to sort of not just simply comment on what you said, but bring something of themselves into the session and share something out of their own sort of insights. Is that what you mean, Prince?
Yeah, because you get a lot of that when you're doing it. You have that, even myself. I'm not always a confident speaker, but you said you touched on a few things earlier around preparation and being ready. And sometimes you can really prepare as much as you can, but when you get on there, your mind almost goes blank, and you're just like, okay, well, good morning, and you just want to get everyone engaged. You might say a joke that doesn't drop. Luckily, I don't know if anyone saw the Will Smith sort of reaction to Chris Rock, but you must say a joke. Nobody really engaged from that joke, and you want everyone to kind of say something, and you go a bit silent, wait for everyone to get on. So I'm kind of trying to find my way to navigate through that and get through to the thick of it, really, and kind of give them that deal.
Well, first of all, thanks, Prince, for your question and for being confident to ask it on the microphone, which isn't easy, but by any stretch. So a couple of thoughts. I think first of all, remembering that respectful silence can often be very genuine. Often people are simply thinking about what you've shared, and it's important to give people the space to do that. I work in a sort of a dev engineering first environment, and you've got a lot of critical thinkers who will often just want to think through. So that's the first thing, giving them space to do that. The second thing is user-generated content above your own content, I find is more impactful and more helpful for engagement. What do I mean by that? So recently I ran a session with a team on leadership, and I asked them to bring in their own images. And I asked them to come up with their own songs that sort of spoke to their own leadership experience. And I tell you not, Prince, I kid you not, Prince, I didn't have to say much, because it was something that was being generated by them. It was something that they'd shared, or we'd do a sort of bring an object exercise where we ask people to bring a prop or something which speaks to a time where they failed. And all of those sorts of things can help people engage. So I think the other thing is, switch it around, try to get the content coming from them where possible. And then, maybe it's people don't want to use a microphone. So if you get people sharing in the chat, people might be more forthcoming if you sort of do that and make it psychologically safe to do that and to share. So up front in your contracting, stress the fact that, look, this is a safe space. What is being shared in the room isn't being shared outside of the room. We talk about that as sort of Vegas rules. And if you've got some of those caveats, that might help people be a bit more forthcoming. I hope that's helpful in some way, Prince.
Yeah, no, massively. Trust me, someone like myself, I find it a bit difficult to be open like that. So it's really good to some of the insights you're giving me. I'll definitely take on board.
No worries.
Prince, thanks for the question, and again, thanks for being so candid. And let me tell you, we've all had a joke that's not landed right, and you just got to laugh at it yourself and crack on with it. Great question. Kenny, what are how do you know if you're doing it right? Right, like building on what Prince just said. Sometimes you're not always getting heads that are nodding, smiling, constantly giving you reactions that tell you they're engaged, especially today when you're doing it virtual. People might not even have their camera on, so you're almost assuming they are just nodding along. So how do you kind of know you're doing it right?
That's a great question. I'm gonna do the classic facilitational sort of trick and say, what do other people think? And here we have respectful silence.
I mean, if you're asking what do we think around what is good, or what you think you've done well, me personally, I always take it in a sense of when people engage and they laugh, or they feel like they're taking something from the facilitation, from the call, I guess. That's why I think that kind of respectively shows what's good. I don't know what else personally, yes.
So we've got some thoughts in the chat. So we've got reactions that come in the chat, getting feedback at the end of the session, questions and thoughts in relation to what you were saying, engagement in the chat again with Zoom reactions. So yeah, there are a few there. Anything to add to those, Kenny?
Yeah, well, I just to jump in.
Go ahead, Greg.
I think for me as well, is once you're driving through the content, you're asking some thought-provoking questions, and then once you can get open in that dialogue, it brings other individuals in because they feel it's more of a safe place. But also, it then allows you to challenge potentially what they're saying, which then leads to a deeper conversation. And for me, then as a facilitator, based on their input and their discussion, their points of views, I know that I'm on the right lines, that I'm going through the content that I'm looking to facilitate around. That's what I look for in terms of whether I know a session's has landed well or not.
That's great, Greg. And I think, you know, all the things you've all said is really helpful. I think I approach it in two ways. One, it's always clearer to me when I feel like I'm getting it wrong. I think that's often the case. You can just sort of, I don't know, some of you might have experienced it. You feel like your words are just falling to the ground in front of you, and you just want the ground to sort of swallow you up. And so it's often clearer to me when it's not going well. And when that's happening, sometimes you just have to pause, you know, gather yourself, and sometimes speak to the elephant in the room, you know. So like I said, when I gave feedback to the execs and said, can we just take a moment to pause here, because something doesn't feel like it's working. I don't feel like I'm making a connection here, or whatever the case might be. And often speaking to that can really, you know, surface what's really happening in the room in terms of engagement. That said, there are things that I would often look for, and I think one of the things I look for is, is not so much whether people give positive feedback, as much as that's really helpful. The thing I look for is, have I been able to challenge people and support people? I think, people can go through, corporate life in particular, and not feel that supported, validated, affirmed, positive feedback given, strengths-based feedback given, or been really constructively, in a kind way, but in an honest way, challenged. And if I'm doing those two things in a session, I feel like I'm sort of adding value.
Kind of building on from that, Kenny, how do you go about collecting constructive feedback? Right. I'm assuming that you sending out a form, and if you are sending out a form, what's kind of the style of questions to make sure you're getting useful data that you can actually work off?
Oh, yeah, good question. And so it touches on a whole sort of area around evaluation in the L&D and OD world, right? Which, it's just a hot topic. And I can tell you what to avoid. You want to avoid the sort of happy sheets, right? You want to avoid the sort of, this session made me feel great. People usually, and what we've often done in the past, is go with the net promoter score question. So how likely are you to recommend this experience to others? I think that can be quite a powerful question. How likely are you to do something differently on the back of this session? But remember, if you do the thing up front in the contracting piece, where you're asking, what is it that was challenging for you today? It's quite easy. And then at the end, if you've sort of touched on that, and you've addressed that, it's quite easy for them to evaluate and make the connection between, I came into the room and I didn't know how to give upwards feedback. I now know how to give upwards feedback. I now feel like I've got some experience and confidence. They're more, when you sort of target those questions, you're more likely to get sort of favorable responses. So I guess in short, there's lots of, technical things you can go into in terms of evaluation design. Do you use Likert scale? Do you not use Likert scales? You keep it binary or not? That's not necessarily my area of expertise, and I should say I don't facilitate as much these days as I used to in the past. But when I think about what some of our vendors would do when we sort of partner together, often it's focused on things like recommender score questions, but also the likelihood that people are going to sort of implement something. And there's a bit of a trick there, isn't there? Because if someone says that they're going to do something, then they're more likely to do it, as almost a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy as well.
It would be great to hear from others in the community if, how do you go about measuring whether you've been successful, whether you've had impact, the desired impact you're looking to have, and how do you go about gathering feedback? Do drop it in the chat and let us know if you're happy to come on. But Kenny, just moving on to kind of the challenges, and there are new challenges that have come about with the way the world has changed in the last couple of years. And I guess the most obvious one being a hybrid audience, right? It's not going to be uncommon to have some of your audience tuning in virtually, whilst the rest of them are physically there with you in the same room. What are some of those challenges that have come up as a result of a hybrid workforce, and how have you overcome those?
Yeah, good question. And we've experienced one of the sort of key challenges today, haven't we, with technology? And I remember a session I was running for a UK government department, and it was the most hybrid session I've ever been in. We had 12 leaders who were in a hotel in South Africa. I was facilitating here in Sydenham in London, and we had a group of other market directors all over Africa, the Africa hub, so Egypt, Morocco, Ghana, Nigeria, and so incredibly hybrid, if that's even a phrase, and the session worked. Or the session went well, and talking about the evaluation question, the way I know is because I was called back to run more sessions. So I'm assuming it went well. But there were issues with technology, and I think there's one thing that's really helpful is to have a sort of a producer role. So you have the facilitator who can really attend to the questions, attend to the experience, and I guess in this context, Kumi and Georgie are sort of playing that role. And yes, it's resource intensive. You may not have available people to sort of do that, but it can be really helpful. The other thing that I sort of do is and again, Nelson, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I actually decide to hardwire my Ethernet cable into my laptop, so I don't use Wi-Fi when I'm running at all. Right. And because of that, it's dramatically changed the experience for me. But again, caveat, I recognize that's not possible for everyone. So, of course, do what you can to get the sort of best service you can. So that's the other thing. And I find that generally when those things are there, you've got a producer, you've got someone that you can sort of turn to. You've taken the time up front to prep the breakout rooms. You can do that, particularly on Zoom. You can create the breakout rooms in advance. And then you've tried to rehearse it either with yourself or with another person. I generally find that that's pretty helpful. This year alone, again, I don't do as much facilitation as I did in the past because of my role. I focus a lot more on sort of change, culture and values and things like that. But this year, I think I've run about near 100 sessions since January, and thank God that technically we were okay. Whereas in the past, where I didn't have the right setup or sort of producer support, it often sort of went a bit pear-shaped.
And how do you bring in the element of, obviously, when you're doing an in-person session, there's the social element of peer-to-peer interaction that didn't need as much orchestration and could happen spontaneously, but obviously it's not as easy when you're virtual. So how do you bring, quote unquote, the element of fun into it, right? One of the questions a member of the community had sent in prior to this event was, how do you ensure you don't bore your participants to death? And going back to the idea of fun again. So what are some of the examples or ways you've brought in to make it more fun and more interesting, but to ensure you're still delivering that outcome?
Yeah, really, really good question. I don't know if you've seen that there's an animation, a sort of a meme with someone on the guillotine or sort of being hung by an executioner, and it says, and there's a PowerPoint slide in front of them, and it's just it's sort of death by PowerPoint, and we've all been on those in those kind of situations. So, I think an immediate place to start is some of the research around how the brain works. I heard, I think Patricia Broderick, who does a lot of work in this sort of agile facilitation sort of space and leadership, talked about this actually recently. And it's this idea of novelty. So, the brain responds well to novelty, contrast, or salience. As in, if you're going to have a set of slides, what is the salient slide? What's the slide that you want to stand out? And there's a book actually that talks about it around presentations, but almost diffusing and making the other slides around it less interesting, and sort of popping out that additional slide. So there's a piece around novelty, contrast or salience, stories and emotions. I mean, we all love stories, don't we? You know, stories are incredibly powerful. So I'll often have, in a lot of my sessions, I'll often create space to ask, well, in fact, before the session starts, I'll often, in the comms leading up to it, I'll prompt people to think about a story or about a time in which something happened. And you get these kind of war story moments that are just memorable. I mean, I bet you could all think right now about a time when facilitation went wrong, or maybe just a story about work life that you've always held on to. And those, Nelson, can be very impactful. So there's the emotion piece. And then Trish Broderick also talks about meaning. And I don't know that this is original to her. I think this is something which has, you know, been generated sort of out in the neuroscience community. But meaning, again, Daniel Pink talks about that, doesn't he? He talks about sort of, well, mastery, autonomy, and purpose is sort of aligned to that meaning piece. So how can you help people sort of make sense and connect with you as a human being? Sometimes that means showing up vulnerably. I find that and I know this isn't so much a fun thing, but the sticky and memorable points in sessions I've run have been when I've showed up and said, hey, do you know what? I made a mistake here, or I said something wrong there. And that sense of sort of selective disclosure of vulnerability, as MIT talk about, can be quite powerful. And then you know, obviously things like bingo, things like quizzes, getting people to do polls, you know, all of those interactive media things, which I think we all, you know, you learn to do that at university, right? When you're sort of, or school, when you're working on group tasks. I think all of those things can be useful as well. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And some great points there, Kenny. And you must see every year someone somewhere predicts the end of classroom training and live training. I'm sure every year the trend is someone thinks it's the end of classroom training and live training. What can we do to change the narrative? Obviously, there's a question of, you know, does the sage on stage really deliver value to the learner? Or is it just a economical way of distributing knowledge, right? And is that the reason why it's survived for so many years? What are your thoughts on that, and how you can approach changing this narrative of, you know, classroom training and live training isn't effective?
Well, I mean, I think I just see Nicola's got a question there as well. Okay, we can come back to that. Tips do you have for supporting people following? That's a really good question. I think. So Nelson, if I'm honest, I think my gut reaction is, I don't know that we'd want to change the narrative.
Right.
And what I mean is, I think a lot of the evidence is there that talks about the ineffectiveness from a sort of memory perspective of traditional classroom events. You know, there was this sort of work by Ebbinghaus, but also my friend and colleague Nick Shackleton-Jones has written a book, How People Learn, talks a lot about memory there. And we know that even from this session, the things that you're going to remember in 2 weeks' time, one, won't be the things that I think you'll remember, but also will be different to what everybody else has remembered. In fact, one of the things, I remember a session I was facilitating, and one of the ladies at the end said to me, and we were talking about, I think we were talking about something to do with bias, unconscious bias. And she said, Kenny, you know, I've really enjoyed this session. Do you know what I've really taken away from this session is just how you involve people in the conversation. And I was shocked by that. I just thought, I mean, I didn't think that would be the thing that she'd take away from it. So there's this sort of piece around that sort of meta piece of what people take away from experiences. But to sort of come back to your point around classroom events, you know, because we know that, you know, people are not likely to remember content, we then have to therefore change our approach. And that's why, you know, we talk a lot about learning experiences that are far more memorable. So if we are going to change narrative, then I'd love to see us change the narrative to focus more on how do we design, how do we facilitate memorable, sticky learning experiences, which is sort of maybe your learning by doing approaches that are far more impactful in the long term, in the long run. And I think if we're going to get a seat at the table as a sort of a function in the business, it's being able to demonstrate impact around performance and results. And the way we're going to do that is not through sort of chalk and talk in a traditional conventional way, but is through sort of impactful experiences. And I would say, in a post-COVID world where we sort of, we seem to be getting closer through technology, but drifting further apart through, whether it's ideology or polarization or whatever the case might be. Actually, the sort of organizational development, the L&D world has a sort of an opportunity to bring us together. And you're seeing a lot of organizations now wanting to build community, especially where they're globally dispersed. And so I think that's another sort of value add that we can sort of lean into to say, actually, the L&D world or to say the need for events hasn't sort of ended and isn't going to end. We're always going to need to gather people, but it's the purpose around which we do that needs to shift.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think a great book to read is Building the Minerva University. And so these guys are essentially disrupting higher education and the way universities operate, starting in the US. But they talk about the principles of a concept called fully active learning. And so most of their curriculum is delivered synchronous, but it's really focused on delivering fully active learning, where the facilitator's key role is to facilitate peer-to-peer exchange, to do application of the knowledge that they had acquired prior to the session itself. But really, really great collection of essays on principles that you can apply to your facilitation. I'm going to come to you, Nicole, to ask your question. If you're happy to come on.
Hi, thanks, Nelson. It's just a question around how do you support people following a session? Because I sort of found like the sessions I've helped to facilitate, it's the sessions happened and then sort of everyone just moves on or goes back to their day-to-day, and then that session, like everything learned in that session, everything discussed sort of just gets forgotten about just because of you're back to day-to-day jobs, and then you get a case of a request, we need this session again, but it's like, well, what has the impact of the last session been before we look at running another session?
Nicole, that's an absolutely brilliant question. Thank you so much for asking that and to give me a chance to sort of offer some thoughts. We often talk about learning transfer in this context and sort of which, it's got some issues as a sort of expression itself. But I think one of the things is taking a marketing approach to L&D and organizational development. Look at the ways in which, marketers, social media, and other, big brands and companies get us to shift behavior and ensure that their agenda is in forefront of our mind. So if I could say anything and stress anything, it would be taking a marketing approach, which is around how can you create a regular drumbeat of comms internally, a regular sort of campaign of, if you like, and that might be a Slack channel. It might be a Slack bot, and you can program a Slack bot if you do use Slack. Sorry, I don't use Teams, so I don't know if you can do it on Teams, but you can program Slack bots to sort of regularly nudge people around particular issues. One of the other things is, how about, Nicole, using the session itself, be productive, be generative in the session. So are there things that they can do when you've got them in that hour that they can actually use when they go? So for example, I was on a session actually yesterday. I give a shout out to Mind Gym, and we partnered with Mind Gym yesterday. They haven't paid me to say this, but I'll give them a shout out. And what we were doing was, what they were doing was asking people to practice giving constructive strengths-based feedback to others. Like what is it they might say? You ended up with sort of 20 to 30 different expressions that people could copy and paste, and it sounds maybe a bit sort of strange or not weird, but they could copy and paste all of those different sort of phrases, and they could play around with it and use it and sort of experiment. So, thinking about what can you do in the session that people can take away. And then the other thing we've done, Nicole, in the past is come up with a set of challenges, team-based challenges. So let's say you're talking about thinking like a customer. You might have 10 things and experiments that people could do with their teams. For example, challenge number 1 might be find someone who you don't know is in your business and find out what their top priorities are. That would be an example of, thinking like a customer. So I tried to be a bit sort of pacey with that because I'm conscious of time, but I hope that was helpful.
Kenny, like you said, we are coming almost to the, thank you for the question again. And Kenny, we're almost coming to the end of the session. One last question for you. What's that one thing people can apply today, this week, to improve their facilitation?
One thing that people can apply, I think it's going to be a boring one, Nelson. I'm sure I'll end the session and think of something different, but practicing the listening that I mentioned earlier. The sort of clarifying, summarizing, paraphrasing. Why is that important from a facilitation perspective? Because I think too often we focus on what we need to say as facilitators without recognizing that unless you've listened really well, whatever you say is less likely to be impactful. So I think one skill that I would recommend we practice, particularly given the world in which we live in now and the climate, is those sort of key listening skills of clarifying, summarizing and paraphrasing. So you're listening and then you respond. So I should say probably listening and responding skills. And those three are ones that I would focus on. I do hope that's helpful for people. Oh,
thank you, Kenny. Thank you again, Kenny. Apologies to everyone again for our connection, but Kenny, you've been absolutely brilliant. So thank you once again for coming on the show. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Hopefully you found it useful. You can absolutely listen back to the show on your favorite podcast app. Our next show will be on the 13th of April. If you want to continue the conversation, please do use the hashtag #DisruptLive. And one last thing is a shout out to our producer of the show, Georgie, who after this will be leaving us to spend more time with her cats and to go find herself. And so Georgie has been absolutely instrumental in bringing together our guests, putting together the show. Literally, we come on and do the easy part, and Georgie's put the show together. So a shout out to Georgie for all her incredible work and all the best with what Georgie goes on to do. And once again, thank you to the community for joining the show. And thank you once again to Kenny. Until next time, take care, be safe, and see you soon.